David Morgan had everything other men quietly measured themselves against: raw power, staggering wealth, and a glass-walled mansion clinging to the cliffs above the thunderous Atlantic. His name alone could turn silence into obedience in any boardroom. His signature could unleash or destroy fortunes, and his empire of hotels stretched from New York to Singapore like a private kingdom. To the world, he was untouchable. The man who had bent destiny to his will, but in the midnight stillness of that palace, where the ocean roared below like an unending reminder of nature's indifference, David's heart raced with one tormenting question: did Vanessa truly love him? Or had she fallen in love with the empire he commanded? At 42, the Titan who once thrived on control now lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet the doubts clawing at his chest. Her smile, Zacchaeus, and radiant and intoxicating, sometimes felt too polished, like a performance rehearsed for an audience. Her kisses, her touch, her whispered words of devotion, were they passion? Or were they carefully calculated investments in her future as Mrs. David Morgan? His friends laughed off his suspicions, calling him paranoid, warning him not to poison the best years of his life with mistrust. But David knew better. He had seen the way money drew not just loyalty, but predators, circling him like sharks just beyond the breakers. The unease inside him swelled like a storm tide smashing against the cliff walls below his home. The more she professed her love, the more he wondered, was she shielding him from the truth? Or was he shielding himself from the inevitable? In the boardroom, David's instincts had never failed him. Yet, in matters of the heart, doubt crept in like smoke through a locked door, suffocating him slowly. And so he began to conceive something unthinkable, even grotesque to a man of his stature. For once in his life, he would relinquish the power that defined him. He would orchestrate his own downfall, feigning weakness, even disability, pretending paralysis itself, just to strip away the mask of the woman he planned to marry. The plan was dangerous, reckless, maybe even self-destructive. But for David, the stakes weren't just love. They were his very dignity, his identity as a man who refused to be deceived. If Vanessa's devotion proved real, he would finally know peace. But if her heart belonged not to him but to the empire he had built, the revelation would shatter him more violently than any hostile takeover ever could. One lie, one false step, and the truth would come crashing down. And when it did, it wouldn't just fracture their love, it would topple the world he had spent a lifetime constructing. The crash wasn't an accident, it was an orchestration. David Morgan planned every detail with the precision of a surgeon carving along a nerve. No stuntmen, no outsiders, no curious onlookers, only the handful of staff who owed their livelihoods to him and were bound by ironclad loyalty. Late that night, on a narrow strip of coastal highway where fog rolled in thick as velvet curtains, the performance unfolded. Tires screeched against wet asphalt, headlights sliced through mist, and then darkness. A car vanished into the void below the cliffs. By dawn, whispers ran like wildfire through the city. The hotel magnate had survived, but just barely. When Vanessa burst into the secluded clinic he'd chosen, the scene had been staged with cruel artistry. David was waiting in a wheelchair, his skin bloodless, lips pressed tight against the effort of stillness. The commanding presence that once filled boardrooms and bent rivals into submission now seemed reduced to fragile silence. From the waist down, he did not move. Doctors, grave and deliberate, delivered their verdict: paralysis, perhaps forever. To the world, it was catastrophe. To David, it was theater, his most dangerous experiment yet. A man who had built empires was willing to surrender his power, to feign helplessness, just to see the truth written across the face of the woman who was meant to marry him. At first, Vanessa's performance glittered. Her voice trembled with believable fear. Her soft hands fussed with the hospital blanket, tucking him in with a tenderness that made the nurses sigh. "Don't worry, darling. I'll never leave you." she whispered, her tone dripping with devotion sweet enough to rot teeth. For a fleeting moment, David almost let himself believe her. Almost. But once the doors clicked shut and the audience vanished, the mask began to slip. He heard the sighs she thought were muffled, heavy and resentful. He caught the rapid tapping of her nails against the armrest, the sharp flicks of her eyes toward her phone, and then came the whispers over hurried calls. "He's ruined everything. I can't live like this. Not like this." David's chest burned with fury, but outwardly he remained still, a patient frozen in fate's cruel grip. Every kiss she planted on his cheek, every staged smile for the household staff. He dissected like a predator tracking prey. The mansion, once his fortress, had become a stage. Vanessa, its lead actress, and David, paralyzed, Fiancée, yet more dangerous than ever, watched her rehearsed lines unravel day by day. The irony was razor sharp. The man who had raised skyscrapers from the steel and glass was now testing love with weakness, measuring loyalty not with contracts, but with fragility. And as the days passed, the verdict grew more damning. Vanessa's affection wasn't love, it was leverage, an investment gone sour, a contract signed not with vows, but with greed. What she didn't know was that David's paralysis was an illusion. He could stand whenever he wished. He could crush the charade with a single step, every sigh of contempt, every careless word. Every flinch of disgust etched itself into his memory like acid carving stone. He wasn't chained by injury, he was chained by choice. And when he finally rose, when the mask shattered, Vanessa would learn the truth. It wasn't David who had been tested. It was her. And her betrayal would be exposed in the cruelest light possible. Soon, the performance would end, and the curtain would fall. At first, Vanessa seemed like the perfect angel of devotion, almost too perfect, as if she had stepped out of a dream carefully scripted for David's fragile world. She floated through the mansion with porcelain grace, her movements precise, deliberate, and impossibly delicate. She poured tea into crystal cups as though each drop carried the weight of healing. Her fingers steady, her eyes soft. When she adjusted the blanket on David's lap, she did it with such reverence that he almost believed her touch could soothe his pain, maybe even reverse time itself. Her laughter, light and effortless, drifted through the vast marble halls like a melody meant only for him. And when she leaned close, whispering promises into his ear, her words clung to him like silk threads, fragile, beautiful, impossible to untangle. To the staff, Vanessa was the very embodiment of loyalty. They admired her in silence, watching her glide past with trays of tea or small gestures of care, convinced that here was a woman who would never abandon her man, no matter how broken his body, no matter how heavy his empire weighed upon him. In their eyes, she wasn't just a wife, she was a guardian angel cloaked in elegance, the rare partner who would stand by a man even when his kingdom had begun to crumble. But perfection is a performance, and performances cannot last forever. By the 5th day, the sweetness began to sour, and the cracks in her angelic mask revealed themselves in subtle but unmistakable ways. The tea, once arriving steaming hot, came late, sometimes lukewarm, sometimes forgotten altogether. Her hands, once gentle and careful, began to place the cup on the table with a faint, irritated slam, a gesture small enough for others to overlook, but sharp enough for David to feel. Her voice, once a soft cascade of warmth, grew quieter. The smiles that once lit her face like chandeliers now flickered and dimmed, replaced with an expression that looked more like calculation or escape. Her eyes betrayed her first. David noticed how they no longer lingered on him, but instead darted toward the window, as if the vast gardens and gilded gates promised a freedom he had unknowingly stolen from her. At night, when she believed he was asleep, David lay still, listening. He heard the restless pacing of her heels against the marble floor, sharp, impatient steps that echoed louder than thunder in the silence of the house. And then came her voice, low, tense, almost venomous, as she hissed into the phone, unaware that her words pierced him more deeply than any blade. I can't do this anymore. I feel trapped. It's like living in a golden cage. Those words shattered him. The cage she described was not a prison of cruelty, but his gift, his empire, his fortress, the mansion he had built with blood, ambition, and sacrifice. To him, it was safety. To her, it was confinement. And in that instant, he realized the cruelest truth. What he had built as a sanctuary, she saw as a cell. The transformation accelerated. Her sighs grew heavier, dragging into the room like storm clouds. Her silences stretched longer, suffocating the space they once shared with laughter. She no longer asked if he was comfortable, no longer touched his hand to remind him he wasn't alone. His dreams, his thoughts, his pain, none of it seemed to exist for her anymore. Instead, she sat for hours bathed in the cold glow of her laptop screen, her face illuminated not by love or care, but by endless conversations that excluded him entirely. David began to feel himself disappearing, fading into the furniture, reduced to a silent prop in the grand theater of Vanessa's carefully curated lifestyle. Every detail screamed betrayal. She would linger for hours in the rose garden, but she no longer sat by his side to breathe in the scent with him. She dressed herself in gowns too fine for an ordinary afternoon, sprayed perfume too intoxicating for the empty halls, and left the mansion without offering so much as a backward glance. These were not the rituals of a devoted wife. They were the preparations of a woman rehearsing for an audience that no longer included her husband. David said nothing. He remained silent in his chair, but his silence was not blindness. His eyes followed her every move, his mind recording every gesture, every hesitation, every betrayal with razor-sharp clarity. The mansion had become a theater, and Vanessa its lead actress. Only now, her mask was slipping, scene by scene, until the sweetness curdled into disdain, and disdain soured into quiet contempt. And though Vanessa believed he was helpless, a fading relic bound to his chair, she was wrong. For behind his silence, behind the stillness of his body, David's mind was alive, watching, listening, and memorizing the truth that dripped from her every sigh, her every careless word, her every step away from him. The change in the mansion's air didn't arrive with thunder or grand pronouncements. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, with the soft click of the front door. Laura stepped inside, carrying nothing more than a worn canvas bag and the faint, homely scent of fresh bread clinging to her clothes. There was no fanfare, no orchestrated announcement, no dramatic sweep of her arrival, and yet her presence disrupted the rhythm of the house in ways no one could have anticipated, disrupted not with noise, but with a kind of unsettling calm. Vanessa had always entered as if the world were her stage, sweeping into rooms like a queen commanding her court. Every gesture demanded notice, every glance insisted on acknowledgement. Laura, however, moved differently. She seemed to belong to the very architecture of the house, her footsteps blending with the echo of its marble floors. Where Vanessa brought spectacle, Laura brought warmth, something soft, human, and quietly defiant against the cold sterility of wealth. She didn't bow or mask her face in pity the way others did when they glanced at David in the chair. She didn't avert her eyes. She didn't speak to him in that patronizing tone of false sympathy. Instead, she looked straight at him, into him, as though she still recognized the man who had once commanded boardrooms and bent empires to his will. To her, he wasn't a relic of former glory. He was simply David. Her first act was deceptively small but seismic in its effect. She placed a steaming cup of coffee on the table beside him. "Morning should smell like this," she said with an unassuming smile, as if she were offering nothing more than the obvious truth. But for David, the gesture cracked something open. The suffocating silence that had haunted the house since his accident lifted, Just a fraction. Enough for him to breathe differently. Laura didn't hover over him with suffocating attention, nor did she force false cheer into the room. She sat nearby, pulled a book from her bag, and began to read aloud in a voice textured with warmth. Her words carried him across landscapes he had forgotten existed, into distant cities, ancient histories, and imagined worlds where despair had no dominion. Every so often, she paused to tell a story from her time with Patience, a fisherman who still dreamed of tides, a retired teacher who whispered poetry on her deathbed. These stories weren't rehearsed or calculated. They were freely given, offered without expectation, as though she were handing over pieces of her soul. The contrast with Vanessa was blinding. Vanessa filled the house with demands, expensive dresses, lavish parties, and endless escapes from what she called her golden cage. Laura, by comparison, brought cinnamon rolls wrapped in simple paper, the sweetness of her laugh folded into the stories she carried. Vanessa sighed at burdens she had chosen to bear. Laura never once called David broken, and in those differences David rediscovered fragments of himself that he thought had died in the accident. He argued with Laura over novels, indulged in debates about politics and philosophy, even endured her teasing about his stubborn expressions. She had a way of pulling from him laughter that was unrefined, raw, and startlingly real, laughter that scraped the rust from a heart locked too long in despair. The most dangerous part, though, wasn't her kindness or her stories. It was her acceptance. Laura never tried to fix him, never treated him as a project. She saw him, not the chair, not the tragedy, not the whispers of invalid, but David. A man still whole, still capable of being seen and known. At night, when Vanessa's perfume lingered in abandoned rooms like a bitter aftertaste, Laura's voice filled the void. She asked about his childhood mischief, about the ambitions he had never shared, about the dreams he had buried long before the accident. She listened, not as a nurse, not as an employee, but as someone who valued the man before her. She gave him something rarer than comfort. She gave him dignity. Soon. David found himself waiting for the soft pad of her footsteps on the stairs, for the rustle of her canvas bag, for the quiet light she carried into spaces Vanessa had left hollow. Each day, the house shed a little more of its theatrical pretense and became something more dangerous, more precious, a home touched by fragile, honest truth. And though he never said it aloud, David knew the arrival of Laura had shifted everything. The experiment was no longer just about exposing Vanessa's greed or testing her loyalty. It had become something riskier, something raw. It had become about rediscovering whether love, real love, free of masks and performances, could still exist within him. The mansion had become a battlefield. Though no swords clashed and no guns fired, the war was quieter, deadlier, a war of presence. On one side, Vanessa, dazzling and venomous. On the other, Laura, steady and luminous. Vanessa stormed through rooms like a tempest dressed in silk. She demanded new gowns from Paris, glittering jewels, invitations to galas where cameras flashed and champagne never stopped flowing. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the halls. "I can't live like a widow in this mausoleum." Every word dripped with resentment at David's immobility, as if his wheelchair were chains shackling her glamorous life. Laura, in contrast, slipped into the house like sunlight through a cracked curtain. She brought no demands, only the warmth of fresh coffee, the laughter of shared stories, the quiet rebellion of treating David like a man rather than a relic. Where Vanessa saw a burden, Laura saw a partner. David felt the fracture widening with each passing day. Vanessa's perfume was intoxicating but suffocating. Roses hiding thorns. Laura smelled of cinnamon and salt air, simple and human. Vanessa scrolled through catalogs, planning her next escape. Laura opened books, coaxing David into conversations about childhood pranks, about his father's stern lessons, about dreams he'd long buried beneath corporate stone. The contrast was brutal. Vanessa thrived in crowds, desperate for validation. Laura thrived in moments, listening, laughing, even daring to challenge him when his arrogance crept back. One afternoon, when he brooded over his supposed loss of power, she snapped a page shut and said, "Maybe power was your cage all along." And to his surprise, he laughed, the first genuine laugh since the accident. But laughter was poison to Vanessa. She despised the sound when it wasn't hers to control. She caught them once in the library, David chuckling at one of Laura's teasing remarks. Vanessa's eyes burned cold. That night, she dressed in diamonds and accused him in a voice dripping acid. "So this is my future? Watching you flirt with a nurse while I rot in silence?" Her fury only sharpened the truth. She wanted an empire, not a man. Laura wanted the man, not the empire. For David. The contrast was no longer subtle, see? It was a canyon splitting open beneath his feet. On one side stood a woman who represented everything he feared, greed disguised as love. On the other stood a woman who represented something he hadn't dared believe in anymore, love without disguise. And in that chasm, his decision was already writing itself. The storm finally broke one fateful evening in the grand dining hall, where the chandeliers glittered like frozen constellations above a silence so heavy it pressed against the chest like lead. The long mahogany table stretched endlessly, covered in polished silverware and untouched crystal goblets, but it felt less like a banquet and more like a battlefield awaiting its first shot. Vanessa stood before him at the far end, her silk gown shimmering under the light, each movement calculated, her beauty sharpened into a weapon. She no longer needed tenderness. Her voice was the blade she carried. "I deserve compensation," she hissed, every syllable dipped in venom. "For the years I've wasted, for the youth you stole, for the life you've ruined. I want the oceanfront house in Malibu. I want $5 million in my account, guaranteed, untouchable. And I want the promise that I will never again be chained to a crippled man." And the words cracked through the marble chamber like a pistol shot, ricocheting off the walls, louder than thunder. David sat motionless, his eyes fixed on her, once, long ago. He had believed this woman capable of love, of loyalty, perhaps even redemption. But tonight, the mask was gone. There were no trembling hands, no staged glances of devotion, only greed, raw, naked, and unashamed, stood where his wife used to be, and then it happened. David's fingers curled against the polished wood of his wheelchair's arms. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed down. His shoulders stiffened, his muscles trembling under the weight of years of silence and deception. The air thickened as though the entire house held its breath. Vanessa's voice faltered. Her tirade caught in her throat as she watched the impossible unfold. First, he lifted himself inch by inch, then foot by foot, until, at last, David stood. He rose with the inevitability of a verdict. Tall and unbroken, the man she thought had been destroyed. The silence became suffocating, like velvet wrapping around the throat. Vanessa staggered back, her perfectly painted face draining of color, her eyes wide as if she had seen a ghost. "You," she gasped, her knuckles white against the table. "You can walk?" David's reply was cold steel. "I could always walk. What I couldn't do, Ska, was trust you. And now, you've given me exactly what I needed. Proof of who you really are." Her jaw trembled, rage colliding with terror in her eyes. You deceived me." "No," he said, stepping closer, his shadow stretching across the marble floor until it swallowed her. "I revealed you." The words cut deeper than any wound. Vanessa's gaze darted desperately toward the doors, the windows, anywhere but his face. But there was no exit, no refuge from the truth, no mask left to wear, no lines left in the script, only the bare, undeniable reality. She had never loved the man, only the empire he built. Her fury cracked, melting into desperation. She fumbled for her clutch, spilling perfume into the air, the sickly sweetness twisting into something acrid, like poison. With trembling hands, she clutched it tight and fled up the staircase, her heels striking the marble in frantic staccato, each step a frantic confession of guilt. When the echo of her footsteps finally died, the mansion felt like a mausoleum. The next morning, the house was quieter than it had ever been. No laughter, no venom disguised as affection, not even the rehearsed intimacy she had once staged so well. Only traces remained, an expensive perfume lingering like a ghost in the halls, the sharp indentations of her heels carved into the marble, reminders of greed that had tried to hollow out his soul. David stood at the terrace, overlooking the restless sea. The salt air rushed into his lungs, cleansing him with a freedom he had not felt in years. For the first time, there was no act, no prison of suspicion, no mask to maintain. The game was over. The storm had passed. And though he was alone, he was no longer shackled. For David, loneliness was no longer a sentence. It was deliverance. When the storm of betrayal finally cleared, David Morgan stood in the ruins of what had once been his certainty. But unlike most men broken by false love, he did not drown in bitterness. He refused. Instead of chasing another romance, David chose silence, reflection. And in that silence, one voice remained, a voice not poisoned by greed, but tempered by truth. Laura. She never asked for anything. No jewels, no promises, no empire. What she carried was a dream, a vision of a place where the elderly and the sick could live with dignity, not pity, where every hand that touched them did so with respect, not obligation. For David, the idea hit like lightning. This was not just her dream, it was his redemption. He had spent his life building palaces for the rich, monuments of glass and steel where luxury suffocated humanity. Now, he would use his power to build something real. "Let's do it," he told her one morning, sliding blueprints across the oak table. "Your agency, not charity, honor, will make it happen." Laura blinked, stunned. "David, you'd invest in this?" "Not invest," he corrected, his eyes fierce. "I'll stand with you." And so they began. The days turned into battlegrounds of a different kind, no longer against deceit, but against doubt, bureaucracy, and financial vultures circling their project. They argued late into the night over designs, over budgets, over philosophy. She wanted sunlight in every room. He worried about costs. She demanded gardens for patients to walk in. He countered with concerns about maintenance. Yet in those arguments, laughter always broke through. Where Vanessa's demands had drained his soul, Laura's stubbornness ignited it. Brick by brick, plan by plan, their partnership grew. They visited construction sites together, boots caked in mud, sleeves rolled up. She wiped sweat from her brow. He rolled blueprints across the hood of a dusty truck. They stumbled, failed, lost money, corrected mistakes, and kept moving. And through the fire of that work, something extraordinary happened. Trust. Not the fragile, transactional trust of romance built on illusions, but a trust tempered in struggle. David realized he was no longer alone in his empire of glass. He had a comrade, a challenger, a partner who made him better by refusing to flatter him. And Laura realized she had more than a wealthy backer. She had someone who believed in her soul. When the first facility finally opened, sunlight streaming through wide windows onto patients' smiling faces, David felt something he had never felt before, pride that wasn't built on numbers, contracts, or profit margins. It was pride born of humanity. And as Laura stood beside him, her hand brushing his, he understood this was no rebound, no distraction. This was the foundation of something greater than desire. Years passed not in fireworks, but in steady embers. What began as a fragile alliance between a wounded man and a stubborn dreamer hardened into something neither of them had expected. David had spent decades in a world where loyalty was bought and love was negotiated like contracts. He had once believed passion was a fire that burned hot, then died cold. But with Laura, passion was never the point. Trust was. They built brick and mortar together, but also trust brick by brick. Each argument about budgets, each laugh over mistakes, each late-night brainstorming session became part of a foundation stronger than steel. She didn't worship him, and he didn't control her. They met in the middle, not as master and servant, not as mogul and nurse, but as equals. The absence of pretense was intoxicating. There were no masks to shatter, no tests to stage. For the first time, David didn't need to question if he was loved for his wealth or his name. Laura loved the flawed man in front of her, the man who carried both scars and power, both doubts and strength. One evening, after the opening of their third care facility, they sat in silence on the terrace of his oceanfront home. The same house that had once felt like a gilded prison now breathed like a sanctuary. Waves crashed against the white cliffs, the sound like a heartbeat echoing through eternity. Laura leaned back, her hair swept by the sea wind, and whispered, "Do you ever regret it? The deception? The pain?" David's jaw tightened. For a moment, memories of Vanessa's venom returned, sharp as broken glass. But then his eyes softened as he looked at Laura. "If I hadn't lived that lie, I never would have found this truth." She smiled, not the smile of a woman charmed, but of a woman who understood. She reached for his hand, not as a gesture of comfort, but as a declaration of partnership. They sat there, hand in hand, not speaking. They didn't need to. The silence was no longer heavy, no longer poisoned by doubt. It was peace. David realized then that love built on trust doesn't roar like a storm. It hums like the ocean at dusk. Eternal, steady, patient. The man who once staged paralysis to uncover betrayal had finally found strength in surrender. Not surrender to greed, not surrender to lust, but surrender to trust. And as the night descended till the white cliffs glowed under the moonlight, to David, they were no longer cold stone. They were proof that even the hardest rock can hold warmth if someone is willing to stand beside you through every tide for the first time. David Morgan didn't feel like a magnate or a victim, or even a survivor. He felt like a man loved not for his empire but for himself. And beside him sat Laura, the woman who had never needed to be tested, because she had already passed the only test that mattered, being real. From betrayal to redemption, David's journey proves that true love is built on trust, not wealth. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat.